I walk into my local coffee shop on a typical Tuesday afternoon. The bell above the door chimes. I catch the eye of a colleague waiting by the counter. The interaction lasts less than 30 seconds, and it follows a perfectly rehearsed rhythm. They smile, raise their cup, and ask how I have been. Without a single millisecond of hesitation, the answer slips from my lips like a practiced reflex. I tell them I am good. I say everything is fine, just keeping busy, and I ask about them. We exchange a polite nod and part ways. On the surface, it is a pleasant, entirely unremarkable human interaction. But I often wonder what we would see if we could pause that exact frame and peel back the layers of that calm exterior. We navigate a modern urban environment that demands this kind of seamless surface. The pace of our days leaves very little room for the complexities of the human internal landscape. We move from crowded subways to open-plan offices, from digital meetings to rushed lunches. The unspoken social contract of these spaces is absolute efficiency. We are expected to package our emotional state into neatly digestible sound bites. We are praised for being low maintenance. We learn very quickly that the question of how we are doing is rarely an invitation for a genuine inventory of our emotional reserves. It is simply a linguistic placeholder. It is a way to acknowledge existence without inviting complication. And so, we adapt. We become fluent in the language of the fine, the good, and the busy. But what if we zoom in closer on the person who just smiled and said everything was perfectly fine? Behind that composed expression, we might find a mind that has been racing at a relentless pace since 4 a.m. We might discover a chest that feels incredibly heavy, weighed down by an invisible, chronic exhaustion. We might find someone who spent the previous night staring at the ceiling, wondering how they will manage the demands of the upcoming week, feeling profoundly alone in a crowded life. Yet, when given a brief window to share a fraction of that weight, they chose the silence. If you have ever felt this specific type of hidden exhaustion, I invite you to join me on this journey. Subscribe and follow along as we explore the architecture of our inner lives together. This choice to hide the burden is not unique to 1 or 2 individuals. It is the daily reality for millions, specifically those who are universally recognized by their peers as the strong ones. The quiet refusal to speak the truth about our internal state is often misinterpreted as simple pride or stubbornness. We assume it is just a refusal to complain. But when we look at this through a lens of deep psychological curiosity, we see something much more sophisticated. The silence is an ingrained survival strategy. It prioritizes immediate emotional safety and social frictionlessness, but the cost is often long-term clarity and connection. We forge this emotional armor over decades, piece by piece, to protect ourselves from the unpredictable nature of genuine vulnerability. To understand this silence, I think we have to examine the structure of the identity we build. In the language of developmental psychology, this is often described as hyper-independence. It is a state of mind where an individual implicitly believes they cannot truly rely on anyone but themselves. It is not merely a preference for doing things alone. It is a deeply wired response designed to protect us from a very specific fear. It is a defense against the experience of being let down, abandoned, or rejected by those we might otherwise depend on. We learn to construct a reality where we are the sole providers of our own stability, entirely eliminating the variable of other people's reliability. On the outside, this trait is heavily rewarded. Society looks at hyper-independence and sees extreme competence. We celebrate the person who never drops a ball, who works late without a word, and who manages crises with a calm demeanor. We offer them promotions and label them incredibly mature. The corporate and social worlds run on the fuel of these reliable anchors. We surround ourselves with people who will implicitly promise to handle things so we do not have to. In an unpredictable world, the hyper-independent person becomes a sought-after commodity. They are the fixed point in a turning universe, absorbing the shocks and tremors of daily life so the machinery of the office or the household can keep running smoothly. But beneath that highly praised exterior lies a complicated shadow. For someone operating from this framework, asking for help does not feel like a casual request. It registers internally as a fundamental admission of defeat. The internal alarm system whispers that needing someone equates to a lack of safety. It suggests that if we depend on another person, we hand them the power to disrupt our equilibrium. The cost of this perfect self-reliance is a persistent, quiet terror of being exposed as fragile. We begin to view our own needs as liabilities. The very idea of leaning on someone else feels less like finding support and more like walking onto an unstable bridge over a deep chasm. We are left with a profound tension. The hyper-independent persona prioritizes absolute self-sufficiency and control, which feels incredibly safe in the short term. However, the trade-off is a deep, structural isolation. We maintain the perimeter of our emotional fortress so efficiently that nothing dangerous can get in, but simultaneously, nothing authentic can get out. We have to wonder what happens to a person when they successfully convince the entire world that they do not need anyone. Integrating this part of ourselves means recognizing that our competence is real, but our invulnerability is an illusion. It is the slow, deliberate practice of holding our capability in one hand while allowing our inherent human need for connection to rest in the other. This fortress is held together by invisible myths we internalize as absolute truths. The first of these is the belief that our personal problems are entirely insignificant. Those who carry the weight for others often possess a highly developed global perspective. We are acutely aware of macro-level tragedies, global crises, and the visible struggles of our peers. We look at our own emotional exhaustion and immediately place it on a scale against the profound suffering of the wider world. We construct an intellectual argument against our own feelings. We look at the data, we survey the geopolitical landscape, and we conclude that our internal fatigue does not meet the necessary threshold to be considered a valid, reportable issue. In our modern era, this comparison is constant. We carry a device in our pockets that delivers an endless stream of global catastrophe and interpersonal drama directly to our eyes. When we feel the creeping numbness of burnout, we scroll through a timeline of genuine despair and tell ourselves we have no right to complain. We intellectualize our fatigue. We look at our warm apartments, our steady incomes, and our physical safety, and we use our privilege as an argument against our own internal reality. We tell ourselves that because others have it objectively worse, our subjective experience of distress is mathematically incorrect. We become our own harshest critics, cross-examining our sadness until it retreats back into the shadows. The shadow side of this intellectualization is total emotional invalidation. By comparing our quiet heartbreak or our chronic stress to systemic crises, we completely erase our right to feel pain. We convince ourselves that speaking about our internal struggles would be an act of supreme selfishness. We create a rigid hierarchy of suffering, and we place our own experience permanently at the bottom. The result is a silent internal void, where our legitimate needs are starved of any acknowledgement. The exhaustion does not disappear just because we refuse to validate it. Instead, it morphs into a heavy, ambient guilt. We feel terrible for feeling terrible, layering a profound sense of shame over the initial layer of unspoken fatigue. Integrating this requires a profound shift in how we understand human emotion. Grief, exhaustion, and loneliness are not finite resources distributed on a global scale. They are deeply personal, biological realities. We might find a way to hold both truths simultaneously. We can remain aware of the broader struggles of humanity while still honoring the quiet distress of our own nervous systems. Prioritizing global awareness offers a sense of perspective, but the cost is often the denial of our own very real human limits. Reframing this means understanding that extending compassion to our own internal weather does not steal compassion away from the world. In fact, it is often the foundation from which sustainable empathy is built. The second invisible myth we adopt is the conviction that showing weakness will inherently burden the people we love. In our mental calculus, we define ourselves almost exclusively as providers of stability. We see our role in the social ecosystem as the structural pillar. We genuinely believe that our relationships are balanced on a specific, unspoken equation. We provide strength and predictability, And in exchange, we are granted a place in the group. We assume that the ecosystem can only survive if we remain exactly as we are, bearing the weight without visible strain. The concept of asking the group to hold us feels like a violation of the very contract that keeps us connected. We see this play out constantly in our daily networks. Every family, every friend group has the designated anchor. When life spirals out of control, everyone turns to this individual, waiting for the reassurance that things will be fine. The anchor handles the logistical nightmares, diffuses the arguments, and absorbs the residual panic of the collective. They become the emotional repository for everyone else's chaotic days, carefully filing away the distress of others while keeping their own carefully concealed. In an exhausting, fast-paced world, being the low-friction friend is a highly valued social currency. We listen to hours of venting over coffee, offer measured advice, and then quietly absorb the tab of our own unexpressed concerns. The shadow of this dynamic is how we begin to view our own internal world. We start to see our unresolved emotions, our fears, and our messiness as a hazardous material. We convince ourselves that if we open up, we will contaminate the lives of the people around us. We look at our partners or our friends, recognize that they already have so much on their plates, and decide that the kindest thing we can do is to remain solid. We choose isolation disguised as generosity. We sit alone with our overwhelming thoughts, convincing ourselves that we are performing an act of noble sacrifice. But this sacrifice creates a profound loneliness, leaving us entirely unknown by the people we spend our lives protecting. This protective stance carries a heavy trade-off. It prioritizes the perceived emotional comfort of others, but the cost is the creation of artificial distance. We withhold the very parts of ourselves that make deep, resonant connection possible. I often consider how we deny our loved ones the opportunity to show up for us. When we refuse to be a burden, we inadvertently build a glass wall, keeping our relationships pleasant, functional, and fundamentally incomplete. Real intimacy is not a pristine exchange of flawless support. It is the willingness to be occasionally difficult, to be messy, and to allow the people who love us the profound dignity of being our anchor when the water gets rough. Beneath the desire to protect others lies the third and perhaps most intricate myth. It is the fragile belief that our value as human beings is entirely dependent on our utility. Deep down, beneath the layers of competence and reliability, we harbor a quiet, devastating assumption. We assume we are only worthy of love, respect, and belonging because of what we can do for others, not simply because of who we are. We view ourselves as mechanisms of service. We believe that affection is a transaction, an hourly wage paid to us only as long as we are actively solving a problem, offering a resource, or maintaining the peace. We forget that value can exist in stillness. In an era obsessed with optimization and output, this belief is constantly reinforced. We measure our days by our productivity. We bring this same framework into our personal lives, attempting to optimize our friendships and romantic partnerships by being the most useful, low-friction presence possible. We become the ultimate advisors, the reliable drivers, the financial planners. We treat our relationships as jobs where our continued employment depends on flawless performance. We volunteer for the extra tasks. We stay late to help a colleague. We organize the family gatherings. We curate an existence where our absence would be logistically devastating, hoping that making ourselves indispensable is an adequate substitute for feeling genuinely, unconditionally loved. The shadow side of this utility equation is a constant, humming anxiety. If our worth is tied to our output, then we can never afford to stop producing. We fear that if we step out of the fixer role, people will simply lose interest in us. Vulnerability stops feeling like an invitation to deeper intimacy and instead feels like a dangerous liability. We become terrified that if we expose our messy, unpolished selves, we will be revealed as ultimately useless. We view rest not as a biological necessity, but as a threat to our social standing. The moment we sit still, the quiet voice in the back of our mind suggests that we are no longer earning our place in the room. Integrating this requires us to ask a terrifying question. What remains of us if we strip away all the acts of service? This framework prioritizes the safety of being needed, but the cost is never knowing if we are actually loved for ourselves alone. Exploring the idea of inherent worth means considering that our presence, even when we are entirely empty-handed, might be enough. It is the challenging shift from doing to simply being. We have to entertain the possibility that the people in our lives might genuinely enjoy our company, even when we are not actively improving their circumstances. Letting go of utility as a shield is the first step toward experiencing unconditional acceptance. To fully understand the architecture of this emotional fortress, we have to look back to its foundations. We do not wake up one morning in our 30s and suddenly decide to become impenetrable. The blueprint for this armor is usually drawn much earlier. Children are perceptive mirrors. Long before we have the language to articulate it, we intuitively learn which behaviors grant us safety and warmth, and which behaviors result in distress or isolation. We observe the adults around us and calibrate our personalities to ensure our own survival. If authentic expression creates chaos in our early environment, we rapidly construct an alternative persona, one that is specifically designed to keep the waters as calm as possible. Many of us grew up in environments where the traditional roles were blurred or entirely reversed. Perhaps there was a parent overwhelmed by chronic stress, financial instability, or their own unmanaged emotions. The child in that environment quickly assesses the situation. They recognize that expressing their own childhood fears will only trigger a crisis in the adult. To maintain equilibrium in the household, the child suppresses their natural needs and steps into the role of the caretaker. We carry these developmental echoes into modern adulthood. The 30-year-old manager who cannot say no to extra work is often the exact same child who learned that being perfectly accommodating was the only reliable way to secure a fleeting sense of safety and approval. The shadow of this early adaptation is the development of a highly sophisticated false exterior. This exterior is perfectly attuned to the expectations of the adult world. It is reliable, independent, and utterly devoid of troublesome demands. The tragedy is that this survival strategy works beautifully. It keeps the peace and garners praise from teachers who applaud such remarkable maturity. But in the process, the child bypasses the critical developmental stage of learning how to be comforted. The child who learned that their tears were a burden simply grows into the adult who sits in their car in the driveway, staring blankly at the steering wheel, wiping their face entirely clean before they walk through the front door. This strategy prioritizes the survival and stability of the early family unit, but the cost is a lingering developmental deficit. We bring this childhood blueprint directly into our adult relationships, unconsciously seeking out dynamics where our only value lies in our utility. Recognizing this origin is not about assigning blame or dwelling in resentment. It is about understanding that the armor was built by a much younger version of ourselves, who was simply trying to navigate an overwhelming world. We might begin to look at our hyper-independence not as an unchangeable personality trait, but as an outdated adaptation. Acknowledging this allows us to gently retire the young caretaker, giving them the permission to finally step off duty. If we bypass the logical explanations and look directly at the nervous system, we discover that this silence is driven by a profound fear of losing control. For someone who has constructed their reality around managing outcomes, dropping the mask does not feel like an act of honesty. It feels like stepping off a precipice. We view our internal landscape not as passing weather, but as a terrifying flood. We believe that if we give voice to the exhaustion, it will consume us entirely. Because we defer these emotions rather than expressing them, our physical body is forced to become the ledger. Emotional suppression is an act of relocation, moving the weight from the conscious mind directly into the physiological structure. We live our lives meticulously managing the flow of our own energy, maintaining an iron grip on our schedules and our reactions. But the physical body rebels against this tight curation. We see this constantly in high-functioning spaces. The person who insists they are never overwhelmed is often the same person quietly navigating chronic tension headaches, unexplained digestive issues, or an inability to sleep deeply. We wake up at 3 in the morning with a racing heart, completely unaware that our body is actively processing what the mind refuses to acknowledge. We treat these physical symptoms as isolated mechanical failures, completely missing the profound connection between our unspoken emotional burdens and our persistent, low-grade physical distress. The shadow side of this rigid control usually arrives in one of two ways. The first is a slow, agonizing dimming of color, where we continue to function but feel entirely hollowed out, akin to a ghost haunting our own lives. The second is the sudden collapse. It is the moment the accumulated pressure finally blows a valve over something entirely trivial, leaving us completely unmoored in a grocery store aisle. It stems from the absolute terror of role reversal. We are paralyzed by the pressure of what might happen if we falter, terrified of seeing panic in the eyes of those who depend on us. So, we swallow the grief, pretending the internal structure is completely sound. This level of suppression prioritizes immediate operational control, but the cost is an immense daily drain on our physical vitality. It is like trying to hold a buoyant object underwater indefinitely. You can manage it for years through sheer willpower, but eventually the effort exhausts the muscles. Integrating this means listening to the subtle, uncomfortable whispers of our nervous system before they turn into alarms. We must slowly accept that occasional loss of control is not a failure, but a biological reality. Releasing the pressure valve intentionally allows us to process the fatigue in manageable increments, rather than waiting for the inevitable systemic collapse. It is a necessary pivot from enduring our lives to actually inhabiting them safely. Dismantling an emotional fortress that has kept us safe for decades is a delicate, gradual process. It does not require a dramatic public confession or an uncoordinated breakdown. It begins with microscopic internal shifts. Before we can offer any real honesty to the people around us, we have to stop obfuscating the truth within our own minds. It starts with the simple, private act of acknowledging our own internal fatigue or sadness without immediate judgment or the immediate urge to fix it. We observe the heavy feeling in our chest and simply name it. We sit with the internal weather, recognizing that we are allowed to feel entirely overwhelmed, simply because we are human beings navigating a complex world. The modern application of this shift involves changing the reflexive script we use with the safe people in our lives. The next time a trusted friend asks how we are doing, we might try replacing the automated lie with a tiny sliver of truth. We can mention that it has been a deeply demanding week, and we're feeling quite stretched. These small, measured phrases act as vital pressure valves, releasing just a fraction of the internal weight into the open air without overwhelming the conversation. They also serve a quiet social function. By admitting our own minor cracks, we implicitly signal to the other person that it is safe for them to be imperfect around us too. The shadow of this new behavior is the intense, almost visceral discomfort it brings. When we start practicing the art of being occasionally unhelpful, it will feel deeply unnatural. We will have to sit with the urge to solve everyone else's problems and deliberately choose to just observe instead. We will watch the world continue to spin even when we take our hands off the wheel. It is deeply unsettling to realize we might be loved even when we are not actively managing the universe. The nervous system will initially interpret this lack of utility as a profound danger, sending signals of anxiety as we step away from our role as the eternal fixer. Sitting with this uselessness is the hardest work. Ultimately, true strength is not the absence of vulnerability, but the courage to integrate it into our daily lives. By stepping out of the armor, we invite the people we care about to reciprocate our support. We shift from a life of endless endurance to a life of genuine presence. It is perfectly fine to be tired, to seek rest, and to let the walls down. You do not have to prove your worth by carrying the entire world alone. Which of these silent trade-offs has most shaped your own life recently? Share your thoughts below as we continue to explore the complexities of our inner landscapes. Thank you for joining me, and until next time, stay simply human.